Hey, I'm Pastor Jim. I'm here for our Reaction Friday video. I'm going to take a look at some teaching that I saw this last week, and I'm going to speak to it probably in a different vein than you've probably heard spoken to it before. This is kind of political speech in a little way. It's aiming there, and that's where a lot of people talk about it, but I'm going to talk about it from the aspect of being a pastor and being responsible, which I don't feel like this was.
I have seen Christians utter this phrase, Pastor, you just don't understand. It's not the government's job to feed the poor. It's the church's job to feed the poor. And I would like to pause here and I would like to say this. I want you to note how evangelicals selectively appeal to the Bible to justify certain governmental interventions like abortion, same-sex marriage, death penalty, war, militarization, immigration, and in the past, segregation and slavery. Notice how they appeal to the Bible to justify the government to intervene in those situations, but they do not appeal to the government intervening when it comes to the poor. And what I want to say to Christians and evangelicals who are using verses like 2 Thessalonians to justify not actually taking care of the poor from the level of the government, I want to say to you this. Hear me. If you are using a text written by an oppressed people to justify ideologies that are causing more oppression, you can be sure you are the oppressor.
Okay, my mother-in-law said that's my digital screen, so I'm sorry if you probably figured out exactly where I had the problem, but we'll talk a little bit. I'm not even going to point out the government doing everything, which I think that does conflict with Scripture, and I think you can't throw out the 2 Thessalonians passage that he's talking about, which what he's saying is if a man refuses to work, then he should not eat. That just means somebody who just won't work. It's not somebody who can't find a job. It's not someone who is in a rough way and is trying everything they can and need help. That's a different thing. And I do think that's valuable in Scripture. I totally agree with him that you can't just go to Scripture and twist Scripture to say what you want it to say, whether you're on the right or the left or whatever political ideology you come from. The Scripture, you should go to the Scripture to find out what it says and then do that. I really have a big problem with the way he went about this. Number one, I want to point at some irresponsible preaching because I think the very thing he's saying don't go to Scripture selectively to support your viewpoint is exactly what this guy did. This is a pastor who had a political point to push about the government helping the poor, and it's pretty obvious what side of the political aisle he's coming from. And he probably sat around and he thought, hey, the Bible's written by oppressed people. I got a mic drop I could put on some people, and it would really charge up his base. And, that oppressor jargon he rolled out. I think that's really ridiculous. Either he's ignorant of the Bible and how it was constructed and written, or he's informed and purposefully or carelessly manipulating people. And you just can't do that. That's not okay. The Bible was written by kings and slaves. There were generals that wrote, fig farmers, people that had never picked up a weapon, and people that had led people to kill thousands. The richest of the rich, possibly the richest that's ever lived, and the poorest of the poor. All of these people God chose from all across the power and political spectrum to provide to prove that he works outside of that. I believe that's part of the reason. You can't say that the Bible was written by an oppressed people, therefore X. You can't do that. That's not true. By the definition of today, it was written by both oppressed and oppressor, but it was ultimately, truthfully written by God, who is neither of those things. When we start twisting Scripture just to back up our political points because we think we can embarrass or manipulate people or demonize a group like this guy's doing, to do what we want to do or back up our personal opinions, or we can just back them down a little bit, make them feel bad and gain a little ground on them. I mean, we've stopped preaching the message of Jesus and we're just preaching our own new message, which is not the gospel. This type of stuff on the right and on the left, both sides, needs to stop. And the more preachers who give into this little push because they can get likes and views and clicks. And this guy's been viewed all over the place. The more preachers that do that, the worse it's going to get, because all they're doing is ultimately destroying people. What this is, it's called eisegesis. When we preach from the Bible exegetically, if you've heard that before, that means you go to the Word and you try to pull out, what does God mean by this? And you take into account the people it was written to, you take into account the story, you take into account God, you take into account all of Scripture, and you say, what do you mean? And I want to accurately reflect this. What this guy's doing is called eisegesis. And what that means, that's just a fancy word for meaning that I go to Scripture or a religious text and I impose my own ideas on top of it. That's wrong. It's never right, and it never leads somewhere good. The fact is, we're all flawed, and what we thought about life to begin with was wrong. And we need Jesus and the Word to help us become more right. That's what we need. So if you listen to this guy, if you've shared this, stop it. Put it down. It's not good stuff. And I'm not even talking about the government point. Personally, I believe that the Bible, when it's talking about written to being philanthropic and to be charity and to take care of the poor and the widows, that is written to the church. But the church is not or a bunch of little organizations. That's written to every person. Every person who follows Christ. And we all have our responsibilities personally to do that. And that's what it comes back to. All of this is just about pointing at somebody else. Whether you're on the left and you're saying the government should do it, when you're on the right going, well, somebody else should do it. Everybody's just pointing at somebody else, and soon they should all be pointing at themselves. It's our job. That's what God's saying with that. That's my take on that today. Hope it wasn't too rough, but here you go.